Suspected of murdering his wife and their 4 children, he was traveling under a false name when he boarded a flight at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Paris police identified him, but not before the flight took off.
With Xavier missing, he quickly became the prime suspect.
It's a turning point in one of the biggest criminal cases of the last decade in France.
The way he carried out the murders, systematically taking the lives of his loved ones, strongly suggests that he believed he was saving them.
He hasn't been seen since the murders in April 2011. Did he take his own life or start a new one somewhere else?
Several bodies buried under the porch, wrapped in plastic bags with small religious items placed next to them.
The morning mist clung to the quiet streets of Nantes, France, like a shroud that refused to lift. It was April 21, 2011, and Detective Inspector Michel Garnier stood before the imposing stone house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann, watching as his team prepared to dig beneath the family's back patio. Something cold had settled in his stomach days earlier when neighbors first reported the eerie silence that had fallen over what was once the lively Dupont de Ligonnès home. Now, as the first shovel broke through the concrete, that coldness turned to ice. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Its tall windows, once warm with light and laughter, now stared blankly like dead eyes. The garden, where children once played and dogs once barked joyfully, lay unnaturally still. Detective Garnier had seen many crime scenes in his 23 years on the force, but something about this place made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the silence, it was the wrongness of it all, as if the very air had been poisoned by secrets. When the first plastic bag emerged from the shallow grave, wrapped carefully in what appeared to be bedding, the detective's worst fears began to take shape. Inside lay the body of a young woman, her face peaceful in death but bearing the unmistakable wounds of violence. As more bags were carefully excavated, each one revealing another member of the Dupont de Ligonnès family, the true horror of what had happened in this house began to unfold. Agnes Dupont de Ligonnès, 48 years old and described by everyone who knew her as gentle and devoted, had been the first to die. Her sleep apnea machine had stopped at exactly 3 in the morning on April 4th, a detail that would haunt investigators for years to come. Beside her in the first grave lay her children, Arthur, 21 years old with his whole life ahead of him, and just 16 and beautiful, who had dreams of becoming a model, and Benoit, 13 and still believing in the goodness of the world. In a separate grave, they found Thomas, 18 and passionate about music, who had been studying at college when his father called him home for what he claimed was a family emergency. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was the family's 2 Labrador dogs, buried alongside their human companions. Even in death, they had not been separated from the family they had loved so completely. Someone had taken the time to wrap each body carefully, to place small religious items with them, as if trying to preserve some dignity in this most undignified of acts. Yet the clinical precision of it all, the methodical way each victim had been drugged with sleeping pills before being shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, spoke of something far more chilling than a crime of passion. The man responsible for orchestrating this nightmare was nowhere to be found. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, 50 years old and bearing the title of Count, had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. But his absence spoke louder than any confession ever could. To understand how a man could destroy everything he claimed to love, we must go back to the beginning, to the golden days when the Dupont de Ligonnès family was the picture of aristocratic perfection. Xavier Pierre-Marie Dupont de Ligonnès was born into privilege in the grand palace city of Versailles, where the very stones seemed to whisper of nobility and ancient bloodlines. His father, Bernard Hubert Dupont de Ligonnès, carried the title of Count, and Xavier grew up breathing the rarefied air of French aristocracy, even as that world slowly crumbled around him. From his earliest days, Xavier was taught that his blood made him special, that he was part of an elite class destined for greatness. He would often speak of this superiority complex with pride rather than shame, once declaring to friends, "I belong to a group of people who are intelligent, determined, balanced, and in good moral and physical health. Such people are rare compared to the masses." These words, spoken with the casual arrogance of someone who had never known true hardship, would later take on a sinister meaning as investigators tried to understand what drove him to such unthinkable acts. But even golden childhoods have their shadows. When Xavier was just 10 years old, his father grew tired of the social pressures and expectations of Versailles society. In a move that would shape Xavier's understanding of family loyalty, Bernard abandoned the city and left his young son in the care of his grandmother. This early abandonment planted seeds of instability that would grow quietly for decades, festering beneath the polished surface of aristocratic breeding. Despite his traditional upbringing, Xavier yearned for adventure, for something beyond the suffocating expectations of noble society. At 20, while still navigating the social circles of Versailles, he met Agnes Hodanger, a young woman from the local bourgeoisie with kind eyes and a gentle spirit. Their courtship was the stuff of fairy tales, two young people from good families finding love amidst the grandeur of France's most famous city. But Xavier's restless heart wouldn't be tamed so easily. Even as he claimed to love Agnes, he left Versailles to seek adventure elsewhere, leaving her behind like his father had left him. When he returned months later, he discovered that Agnes had found comfort in another man's arms and was pregnant with his child. In a world where social reputation meant everything and scandal could destroy a family's standing, Xavier made what seemed like a noble gesture. He married Agnes anyway and adopted her son Arthur as his own. It was a decision that spoke to his complex character. Here was a man capable of great kindness and forgiveness, yet also someone who seemed to collect people's debts to him, storing up every sacrifice like currency he might one day demand be repaid. Arthur would grow up knowing Xavier as his father, never suspecting that this family secret would one day be written in his blood beneath a concrete patio. The young couple didn't remain in Versailles, where whispers and knowing looks would have followed them everywhere. Instead, they embarked on what seemed like a romantic adventure, traveling across France throughout the 1990s as their family grew. Thomas was born in 1992, Xavier's first biological son and the child who seemed to carry all his father's hopes for continuing the family line. And arrived in 1995, a daughter who would grow into stunning beauty and quiet intelligence. Finally, Benoit completed their family in 1998, a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle disposition. For a time, it seemed like Xavier had found his place in the world. Here was a man who could reinvent himself away from the crushing weight of aristocratic expectations, who could be a husband and father first and a count second. But the early 2000s brought new challenges that would test the very foundation of their happiness. Xavier had always dreamed of America, that land of opportunity where a man could become anything he chose to be. In the early 2000s, the family attempted to immigrate to Florida, seeking a fresh start where Xavier's noble title would mean nothing and his success would be measured only by what he could build with his own hands. It was a brave decision for someone raised to believe that his worth came from his bloodline, but it was also a catastrophic failure. The immigration process devoured their savings like a hungry beast, consuming money they couldn't afford to lose while giving them nothing in return. When their application was ultimately rejected, Xavier was forced to return to France not as a conquering hero who had seized his American dream, but as a defeated nobleman who had gambled everything and lost. The financial strain of this failure would haunt the family for years to come, creating cracks in their foundation that would eventually split wide enough to swallow them all. They settled in Nantes, in the beautiful house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann that would eventually become their tomb. To the outside world, they seemed to have recovered from their American disappointment. The children thrived in their private Catholic schools, Arthur growing into a responsible young man who worked part-time at a local restaurant, Thomas discovering his passion for music at college and blossoming into a stunning teenager who modeled for catalog companies, and young Benoit earning the love of everyone who met him with his infectious smile and kind heart. Agnes found work as an assistant at a Catholic school, throwing herself into helping other people's children with the same devotion she showed her own. She was beloved by students and colleagues alike, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and always had a kind word when someone was struggling. Her faith was genuine and deep, providing an anchor in what was becoming an increasingly turbulent marriage. But beneath this picture of domestic bliss, Xavier was drowning. His attempts to establish himself as a successful businessman had failed one after another. The hotel guide and membership card program he'd launched never found their footing in the marketplace. Other ventures followed the same pattern, initial enthusiasm giving way to mounting debts and eventual collapse. Each failure chipped away at the image he so desperately needed to maintain, the image of a nobleman who could succeed at anything he touched. By 2002, the cracks in the marriage had become impossible to hide, even from the children. Agnes, normally so patient and understanding, began to voice her frustrations in online forums where she thought she could speak freely. Her words, discovered later by investigators, painted a picture of a woman slowly suffocating under the weight of her husband's rigid expectations and emotional distance. Xavier is too judgmental, too quick to argue, too rigid, too military, she wrote in one post that would later haunt everyone who read it. There's no more tenderness between us, no more attention, no softness, no sex. When I ask him if he's happy, his response is the same. Yes, I am, but if we could all die tomorrow, that would be better. Those last words, if we could all die tomorrow, that would be better, would echo through the investigation like a prophecy written in blood. Even then, years before the murders, Xavier was already imagining a world where death might be preferable to the slow humiliation of financial ruin and social disgrace. The situation grew worse in 2005 when Agnes took the unprecedented step of filing a police report against her husband for attacking Arthur. In a family where maintaining appearances was everything, this public acknowledgement of domestic violence represented a complete breakdown of the careful facade they had maintained for so long. The report detailed how Xavier's frustration with his failures had begun to manifest as anger toward the son who wasn't truly his own, the living reminder of Agnes's brief betrayal so many years earlier. Financial pressures continued to mount as Xavier's businesses failed and their inherited money dwindled. They were living off Agnes's family inheritance, a fact that must have been particularly galling for a man raised to believe that providing for his family was the most fundamental measure of his worth as a husband and father. By 2011, even that safety net was almost gone, leaving Xavier staring into an abyss of poverty and public shame that his aristocratic pride simply couldn't accept. In desperation, he had taken a mistress in Paris, a woman who represented both an escape from his suffocating domestic situation and, more practically, a potential source of funds. He borrowed 50,000 euros from her, money he had no realistic way of repaying. In emails to this woman that investigators would later analyze for clues to his state of mind, Xavier revealed the depth of his despair with chilling clarity. "I am ruined, at rock bottom like never before," he wrote in 2010, the words carrying the weight of a man who saw no way out of his circumstances. "I am awake almost every night with these morbid ideas. Burning down the house after giving everyone sleeping pills, or killing myself so that Agnes gets 600,000 euros. In any case, my life will end in the next few months if I don't get 25,000 euros immediately. Most of the time I am not in a dream but in a nightmare, and I can't escape except, of course, by doing something radical and final." The phrase, "something radical and final," would prove to be the most accurate prediction Xavier ever made. Even as he wrote those words, the seeds of his family's destruction were already taking root in his mind, growing in the dark soil of his desperation and wounded pride. The death of his father, Count Bernard Hubert Dupont de Ligonnès, in January 2011 marked the beginning of the end for the family. Xavier had always maintained a complicated relationship with the man who had abandoned him as a child, but he had also held on to hope that his father's death might bring some financial relief to his desperate situation. When he went through his father's belongings, searching for money or valuables that might save his family from ruin, he found nothing but more evidence of financial failure. What he did find, however, was his father's .22 caliber rifle, the weapon that would soon become the instrument of his family's destruction. It was as if fate itself was placing the means of his final solution into his hands, offering him a way to end the nightmare of financial ruin and social disgrace that was consuming his life. In February, just weeks after his father's funeral, Xavier obtained a gun license and began frequenting a shooting range outside Nantes. He would sometimes bring Thomas and Benoit with him, teaching his sons to shoot with the same methodical precision that characterized everything he did. The boys enjoyed these outings with their father, never imagining that he was preparing for the most horrible act a parent could commit. During the weeks leading up to the murders, Xavier's behavior took on the systematic quality of a man following a carefully planned script. He purchased cement, chalk, lime, bullets, cleaning supplies, garbage bags, a spade, and a trolley, the tools needed not just for murder, but for the careful disposal of bodies. Neighbors would later remember seeing him loading these items into his car, but at the time, no one thought to question what a respectable count might need with such materials. He also began the process of erasing his family's existence from the world of the living. He paid off remaining debts, including the final bills for his children's private schools, and closed all the family bank accounts. The lease on their house was terminated, and a note was taped to their mailbox instructing the postman to return all mail to sender. It was as if Xavier was systematically deleting his family from existence, preparing the world for their absence even before he had killed them. On April 3, 2011, the Dupont de Ligonnès family was seen for the last time as a complete unit, having dinner together at a local restaurant. Witnesses would later remember them as seeming happy and normal, just another family enjoying an evening out together. Agnes smiled and chatted with the children. Arthur looked relaxed after a day at work, and even Xavier appeared at ease. None of the other diners could have imagined that they were witnessing the last supper of a family about to be destroyed by the man who claimed to love them most. That night, as the family slept peacefully in their beds, Xavier began his methodical execution of the people he had promised to protect. Agnes, trusting and unsuspecting, was likely the first to die. Her sleep apnea machine, which had faithfully monitored her breathing for years, recorded its last reading at 3 a.m. on April 4th before falling silent forever. Whether she woke to see her husband standing over her with the rifle, or whether the sleeping pills he had somehow administered kept her unconscious until the end, is a question that haunts everyone who has studied this case. The children followed, each one drugged into unconsciousness before being shot twice in the head with cold, clinical precision. Arthur, the young man who had grown up believing Xavier was his biological father, who had worked hard to help support the family, who had never known the secret of his true parentage. Thomas, the musician with gentle hands and a kind heart, who had shared his father's love of target shooting, never knowing he was training with the weapon that would kill him. And beautiful and innocent, with dreams of modeling and a future that stretched endlessly ahead of her. And finally, Benoit, just 13 years old, still believing in the goodness of the world and the love of his family. Even the family's beloved Labrador dogs were not spared. In Xavier's twisted logic, perhaps he convinced himself that he was being merciful, that he was sparing them the pain of losing their human family. Or perhaps they were simply witnesses that needed to be eliminated. Whatever his reasoning, he killed them too, ending every beating heart in that house except his own. What followed was perhaps even more chilling than the murders themselves. With the same methodical precision that had characterized his business planning, Xavier set about disposing of the bodies. Working alone in the dark hours of the night, he wrapped each family member carefully in bedding and plastic bags, as if trying to preserve some dignity even in death. He dug shallow graves beneath a concrete patio in their backyard, the physical labor made more difficult by the back and neck problems that had plagued him for years. The placement of small religious items with each body suggested that Xavier saw his actions not as murder, but as some twisted form of mercy. In his mind, perhaps he was saving his family from the shame and poverty that he believed would destroy them more surely than bullets ever could. He was maintaining their dignity by ensuring they would never have to face the world's judgment of their father's failures. But Xavier's behavior in the days following the murders revealed the fractures in his psyche that even his careful planning couldn't hide. He used the family's computer to send messages assuring relatives that they were fine, posting on Catholic forums and sending emails that were meant to buy him time before the bodies were discovered. Yet the messages contained subtle errors and inconsistencies that would later provide investigators with crucial evidence about the timeline of the murders. On April 11th, he sent a bizarre, rambling 4-page letter to family members claiming that the family had been relocated to the United States under the Witness Protection Program due to his secret work for the DA. The letter, filled with grammatical errors that were uncharacteristic of the usually meticulous Xavier, read like the desperate fabrication of a man whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. "We have been relocated under federal protection," the letter claimed, weaving an elaborate fantasy about international drug operations and government secrets. "Do not try to contact us for several years. Tell anyone who asks that we moved to Australia for work." The letter was unsigned, as if even in his desperate state, Xavier couldn't bring himself to put his name to such an obvious lie. After sending this final piece of misdirection, Xavier began what investigators would later call his goodbye journey, a strange odyssey through southern France that seemed designed more as a farewell tour than a serious attempt at escape. He checked into hotels using his real name and credit cards, withdrew money from ATMs in full view of security cameras, and made no effort to disguise his appearance or avoid detection. His first stop was the Hotel Premier class near Toulouse, far from Nantes but still within France. From there, he moved southeast to the Provence-Alpes Côte d'Azur region, checking into the Auberges de Cassagne under the alias Mr. Laurence Xavier, a name that investigators noted contained elements of his own identity jumbled together like pieces of a broken puzzle. The choice of southern France for his final journey was not random. This was a region where Xavier had lived during happier times in the 1980s, where he had memories of a younger self who still believed in the possibility of happiness and success. He even reached out to a former girlfriend during his stay, though they never met in person. It was as if he was trying to say goodbye not just to his life, but to all the versions of himself that had existed before he became a killer. On April 14th, he withdrew €30 from an ATM in Nice, a pathetically small amount for a man who had once managed substantial family finances. That night, he checked into the Hotel Formula 1 in Roquebrune-sur-Argens, a location near the Mediterranean coast that would prove to be the furthest point he reached from Nantes. Surveillance cameras captured him that evening, carrying a bag that investigators believe contained the rifle he had used to kill his family. The next morning, April 15th, Xavier checked out of the hotel and vanished without a trace. He left his car behind, choosing to continue on foot or by public transportation into the rugged forests and mountains of the region. Since that moment, despite extensive searches, numerous reported sightings, and even false arrests that made international headlines, no one has seen Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès or found any trace of what became of him. Meanwhile, back in Nantes, the house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann sat in unnatural silence. Neighbors noticed that Agnes's car hadn't moved for days, that the usually lively home had become as quiet as a tomb. When they finally called police for a wellness check, officers found a house that looked normal on the surface but felt wrong in ways they couldn't immediately identify. The first police searches found nothing obviously suspicious, just a house where the occupants appeared to have left in a hurry. Bed sheets were missing, closet doors stood open, and photographs had been removed from their frames, but these details seemed consistent with a family that had packed quickly for an unexpected move. It wasn't until the fourth search on April 21st that Detective Inspector Garnier, following his instincts about the wrongness of the Too Quiet house, ordered his team to dig beneath the patio. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through France and beyond. This wasn't just another domestic violence case or family murder. This was the systematic execution of an entire family by someone who should have been their protector. The methodical nature of the killings, combined with Xavier's carefully planned disappearance, captured the public imagination in a way that simpler crimes never could. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and international in scope. Police combed through caves and forests in the region where Xavier was last seen, following up on tips and possible sightings from around the world. They analyzed his psychology, his finances, his relationships, and his movements with the kind of attention usually reserved for cases of national security. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had been slowly disintegrating under pressures that he felt were impossible to bear. Xavier's aristocratic upbringing had ill-equipped him for the realities of modern life, where titles meant nothing and success had to be earned rather than inherited. His inability to provide for his family in the manner he believed they deserved had created a shame so profound that death seemed preferable to living with the humiliation of failure. The case has spawned countless theories about Xavier's fate and whereabouts. Some investigators believe he followed through on his final plan and took his own life in the forests near Roquebrune-sur-Argens, his body hidden by the rugged terrain and wild animals. Others point to his language skills and international connections as evidence that he could have escaped France and started a new life elsewhere. There have been numerous reported sightings over the years, from monasteries in France to the streets of Chicago. In 2019, a man traveling on a stolen French passport was arrested in Scotland, sparking international headlines before DNA testing proved he was not Xavier. Each false alarm has served only to deepen the mystery and maintain public fascination with a case that seems to defy resolution. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all are the family members who refuse to believe that Xavier could have committed such horrific acts. His sister Christine has maintained a blog for years, challenging the official narrative and insisting that her brother was somehow framed or coerced into disappearing. Her loyalty speaks to the Xavier that once existed, the loving father and husband who would have died to protect his family rather than destroy them. But the evidence is overwhelming. The forensic analysis, the timeline of events, the careful planning that preceded the murders, and Xavier's own words in emails and letters all point to a man who made the most terrible choice imaginable. Faced with what he saw as inevitable disgrace and failure, he chose to end not just his own life but the lives of everyone he claimed to love. The house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann stands empty now, its windows dark and its garden overgrown. Local children whisper that it's haunted, and perhaps they're right. The ghosts that linger there are not supernatural beings but the memories of a family that should still be alive, of children who should have grown up to have families of their own, of a woman whose kindness and faith deserved so much better than the betrayal that ended her life. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès remains on Interpol's most wanted list, his photograph aging artificially as investigators guess at how the years might have changed his appearance. Whether he is alive somewhere in the world, living under an assumed identity and haunted by what he has done, or whether his bones lie scattered in some remote forest in southern France, may never be known. What we do know is that 5 innocent people and 2 beloved dogs died because one man's pride was more important to him than their lives. We know that a family's love and trust were repaid with the ultimate betrayal. And we know that somewhere in the world, a killer walks free or rests in an unmarked grave, leaving behind questions that may never be answered and wounds that will never fully heal. The case of the Dupont de Ligonnès family murders stands as a chilling reminder that evil can wear the mask of respectability, that the greatest monsters are often those we trust the most, and that some mysteries are destined to haunt us long after the headlines have faded and the world has moved on to other tragedies. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying truth of all is how completely a man can destroy everything good in his life and then simply vanish, as if he had never existed at all.